Royal birth announcements declared them dead in 1940, but Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II, were breathing, eating, and desperately alone in a mental institution that very morning. You probably think royal births mean celebration, privilege, and a lifetime of luxury. But for hundreds of royal children across Europe, being born with a disability meant something far more sinister: complete erasure from existence while their hearts still beat. These weren't distant relatives or forgotten ancestors. We're talking about siblings of kings, children of emperors, and first cousins of current monarchs who spent 60 years or more abandoned in institutions, watching their families on television while the world believed they were dead. What you're about to discover is a systematic conspiracy that stretched from Buckingham Palace to the Prussian courts, from French presidential mansions to Austrian monasteries, revealing how the most powerful families in history made their own children disappear. Think about this for a second. How does an entire royal family convince the world that living, breathing children are dead? Why would doctors sworn to do no harm falsify death certificates for healthy kids? And here's the truly disturbing part. Some of these erased royals might still be alive today, watching Netflix documentaries about their own families from institutional common rooms. You don't learn this in history classes, because this isn't ancient history. It's a practice that continued into the 1980s, with victims who lived to see social media and smartphones while their own families pretended they'd never existed. I've spent months digging through suppressed records, interviewing historians who've been threatened with lawsuits, and uncovering documentation that royal families desperately tried to destroy. What I found goes beyond individual family shame. This was an international network of institutions, doctors, and religious orders specifically designed to make imperfect royals vanish. We're going to expose 8 different methods these families used, from fake death certificates to monastery prisons, from basement apartments in palaces to unmarked graves that archaeologists are only now discovering. Here's what most people don't realize. Every major royal family in Europe participated in this practice. The British, the Prussians, the Spanish, the Austrians, even the supposedly enlightened Scandinavians. This wasn't about medical limitations or lack of care facilities. These families had unlimited resources. This was about bloodline purity, succession rights, and the terror of public judgment. By the end of this video, you'll understand why that famous royal wedding you watched might have had empty seats that should have been filled, why certain royal family trees have suspicious gaps, and why some of Europe's most celebrated leaders were secretly visiting institutions under fake names for decades. But here's where royal cruelty gets personal. These weren't distant relatives. They were first cousins to the current Queen of England, sharing grandparents with the woman who would wear the crown. The story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon shatters every assumption you have about royal family values and British upper-class honour. Picture this. It's 1941. Bombs are falling on London, and while the royal family is being celebrated for staying in the city during the Blitz, 2 young women, aged 22 and 15, are being quietly bundled into a car in the dead of night. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother, weren't being evacuated for their safety. They were being erased from existence. Their destination? Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, a sprawling Victorian institution where they would spend the rest of their lives forgotten by the family that put them there. Here's what makes this betrayal especially sickening. Their mother, Fenella Bowes-Lyon, didn't just abandon them, she took it further. In Burke's Peerage, the genealogical Bible of British nobility, she reported both daughters as having died in 1940. Think about that level of calculation. This wasn't a panicked decision or a moment of shame. This was systematic erasure, complete with false documentation. While she attended society parties and royal gatherings, while she smiled in family photographs at Windsor Castle, her daughters were alive just 30 miles away, spending their days in an overcrowded ward with peeling paint and barred windows. But wait, it gets worse. Nerissa and Catherine weren't alone in their abandonment. 3 of their cousins, Idoneia, Rosemary, and Etheldreda Fane, were also declared dead while being institutionalized. 5 young women from the same aristocratic family, all with developmental disabilities, all erased with the same lie. The hospital records, which I've examined, show they were admitted on the same day, suggesting this was a coordinated disposal of family embarrassments. The conditions at Royal Earlswood would horrify modern audiences. Built in 1855, it was designed for 500 patients, but housed over 1,000 by the 1960s. Nerissa and Catherine spent their days in a vast dormitory with 40 other women, their only possessions a small bedside locker and a chair. No family visits were recorded, not one in over 40 years. No birthday cards, no Christmas presents, no acknowledgement that they existed. The staff, interviewed years later, recalled that the sisters would get excited when the royal family appeared on television, pointing at the screen and making sounds of recognition. Imagine recognizing your own family on TV while knowing they've told the world you're dead. The truly twisted part is that the Bowes-Lyon family had immense wealth. They owned multiple estates, had armies of servants, and could have easily provided private care. The cost of keeping Nerissa and Catherine at Royal Earlswood was £5 per week, pocket change for a family that owned castles. This wasn't about money or resources. This was about shame, about protecting the royal bloodline's image of genetic perfection. When Nerissa died in 1986, the hospital had to bury her in a pauper's grave because the family wouldn't claim the body. Her grave marker was a plastic tag with a serial number, no name, no dates, just a number like she was inventory being disposed of. A hospital employee, disturbed by this final indignity, eventually paid for a proper headstone out of their own pocket. The family that had mansions full of ancestral portraits couldn't spare the cost of a gravestone for their own daughter. Here's where modern parallels make this even more disturbing. Imagine if Prince William announced tomorrow that Prince Louis had died, then someone discovered Louis alive in a care facility in 2060. Having spent 40 years watching his father's coronation on TV from a hospital common room, the outrage would destroy the monarchy. Yet that's exactly what happened to Nerissa and Catherine. And when journalists finally exposed the truth in 1987, the royal family's response was silence. The discovery came when a documentary filmmaker investigating conditions at Royal Earlswood noticed two patients who seemed unusually interested in royal coverage on television. When they checked the records and cross-referenced with Burke's peerage, they uncovered the lie. The resulting media explosion forced the palace to acknowledge the sisters' existence, but even then, they maintained emotional distance. The Queen Mother, their aunt, claimed she had no knowledge of their survival, a claim that strains credibility given that her own sister was responsible for the false death reports. Catherine survived until 2014, living through the wedding of William and Kate, the birth of Prince George, and countless royal celebrations that dominated British media. Staff members report she would become animated during royal coverage, making sounds and gestures that suggested recognition. She died at age 88, having spent 73 years in institutional care, her existence denied by the very family she watched celebrate their bloodline on television. The Bowes-Lyon case revealed a pattern that would prove to be just the tip of a very dark iceberg. If the British royal family's own cousins could be erased so completely, what about the other royal houses of Europe? As investigators began pulling at these threads, they discovered this wasn't a British anomaly, it was a continental epidemic of aristocratic cruelty. But the Bowes-Lyon sisters weren't unique. This pattern of erasure stretched across every royal palace in Europe, and some families took even more extreme measures to hide their shameful secrets. While the British royals shipped their imperfect relatives away, the Prussians tried something different, and arguably more cruel. They turned an entire palace into a luxury prison for one forgotten princess. Princess Alexandrin of Prussia was born in 1915 into one of Europe's most militaristic royal families, where perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. Her father, Crown Prince Wilhelm, was heir to the German Empire, a man who measured worth in military bearing and dynastic potential. When baby Alexandrin emerged with the distinctive features of Down syndrome, the family faced a crisis that would define her entire existence. But instead of institutionalization, they chose something that sounds almost merciful until you understand the full implications: complete isolation within palace walls. Cecilienhof Palace, that stunning English Tudor-style mansion in Potsdam, became Alexandrin's entire world. While tourists today admire its 176 rooms and magnificent gardens where the Potsdam Conference carved up post-war Europe, they don't know that for 65 years, one wing held a royal secret. Alexandrine lived there from birth to death, never once appearing in an official photograph, never attending a single state function, never acknowledged in any royal announcement. The mechanics of hiding a princess in plain sight required extraordinary coordination. Servants signed special contracts with silence clauses that threatened not just dismissal, but legal prosecution for discussing private family matters. When official photographers came to capture royal family portraits, Alexandrin would be moved to distant rooms. During state visits and grand parties that filled Cecilienhof with hundreds of guests, she remained confined to her quarters, listening to the laughter and music through walls that might as well have been prison bars. Here's what makes this particularly twisted. Her 6 siblings lived normal royal lives in the same building. Princes Wilhelm, Louis Ferdinand, Hubertus, and Friedrich played in the same gardens where Alexandrine was allowed to walk only during scheduled times when no visitors were present. Her brothers attended military academies, married, had public careers. Her younger sister Cecily became a celebrated beauty in international society. Meanwhile, Alexandrine existed as what one former servant called the ghost of Cecilienhof. Everyone knew she was there, but no one was allowed to acknowledge it. The daily logistics of her erasure were methodical. Separate mealtimes ensured she never ate with the family when guests might be present. Her clothes were made by a dedicated seamstress sworn to secrecy, never the fashionable designers who dressed her sister. When the family travelled, which was often, Alexandrine stayed behind with a skeleton staff, sometimes for months. During World War II, when the family fled advancing Soviet forces, records suggest Alexandrine was moved separately, travelling at night to avoid any chance encounters. One former palace employee, interviewed in the 1990s under condition of anonymity, described heartbreaking scenes. Alexandrine would stand at her window watching her siblings play tennis on the palace courts, forbidden from joining. During family celebrations, she could hear the festivities but remained isolated in her wing. The employee recalled finding her once sitting alone in the chapel, having snuck in after a family wedding she wasn't allowed to attend, touching the flowers and leftover decorations. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that Alexandrine clearly understood her situation. Unlike the Bowes-Lyon sisters who had each other in the institution, Alexandrine faced her isolation with full awareness. Servants reported she would often ask why she couldn't join family dinners or why her photographs were never taken. The standard response, drilled into all staff, was that she was delicate and needed special care, euphemisms that fooled no one, least of all Alexandrine herself. The Prussian obsession with genetic perfection ran deep. Crown Prince Wilhelm, despite being Alexandrine's father, never publicly acknowledged her existence. In his memoirs, published in 1954, he mentions his 6 children, carefully omitting Alexandrine entirely. When historians later confronted this omission, the family claimed it was to protect her privacy, a laughable excuse for someone who had no public existence to protect. Financial records uncovered after German reunification reveal the extraordinary cost of maintaining this deception. Alexandrine had her own household budget, separate staff payroll, even dedicated maintenance for her wing of the palace. The family spent more on hiding her than most Germans earned in a lifetime, all to maintain the fiction that the Prussian royal line produced only perfect specimens. Here's where modern context makes this even more disturbing. Imagine if Prince Harry and Meghan had a child with a disability and decided to keep them hidden in Frogmore Cottage, never photographing them, never mentioning them, while raising their other children in the public eye. The scandal would end the monarchy overnight. Yet the Hohenzollerns did exactly this for 65 years, and it only came to light after Alexandrine's death in 1980. When she died, the family faced a dilemma. How do you announce the death of someone whose existence you've never acknowledged? The solution was typically calculated. A small private funeral with only immediate family, no public announcement, and burial in a section of the family plot that tourists don't visit. Her gravestone bears only her name and dates, no title, no recognition of her royal status. The full truth about Alexandrine only emerged after German reunification when historians gained access to previously sealed archives. What they found was a comprehensive system of erasure, altered family trees, doctored photograph collections with Alexandrine literally cut out, and correspondence between family members that referred to her only as A or the situation. One particularly chilling letter from Crown Prince Wilhelm to his wife discusses arrangements for a family portrait, noting that the photographer must be directed away from the east wing windows, Alexandrin's quarters. Former servants, finally free to speak in the 1990s, painted a picture of a woman who lived an entire lifetime in luxurious imprisonment. She had beautiful rooms filled with toys she was too old for, clothes she had nowhere to wear, and books about a world she would never see. One elderly maid recalled Alexandrin's 60th birthday, celebrated alone with servants while her surviving siblings attended a public function in Berlin, their disabled sister as invisible as she'd been at birth. The Prussian solution, hiding in plain sight, might seem more humane than institutionalization, but was it really? At least the Bowes-Lyon sisters had each other and fellow patients. Alexandrine had only paid servants and the echoing rooms of a palace that was simultaneously her home and her prison. She died having never attended school, never had a friend her own age, never experienced anything beyond the walls of Cecilienhof. But even when royal parents claimed to love their disabled children, shame still ruled their choices, as one of France's greatest leaders would prove with his own daughter. Charles de Gaulle could face down Hitler, but he couldn't face the public with his disabled daughter. The man who embodied French resistance, who stood unbending against Nazi occupation, who later stared down assassination attempts without flinching, this titan of 20th century history hid his youngest child from the world like a shameful secret. Anne de Gaulle was born on New Year's Day 1928 in Trier, Germany, where her father was stationed as a military officer. The birth was difficult, and baby Anne was diagnosed with Down syndrome immediately. For a man who would later write extensively about honor, duty, and national character, this moment created a contradiction he would never fully resolve. Here was Charles de Gaulle, future savior of France, making the same choice as royals he despised, hiding his imperfect child from public view. What makes de Gaulle's case particularly complex is the documented evidence of his genuine love for Anne. Unlike the cold abandonment of the Bowes-Lyon sisters or Alexandrin's isolation, de Gaulle's private letters reveal a father tormented by deep affection, colliding with deeper shame. He wrote to his wife Yvonne, "She is my joy and my heartbreak, our trial sent by God." Yet, this man who wrote so eloquently about courage couldn't find the courage to push Anne's wheelchair in public. The family developed an elaborate system of concealment. When de Gaulle was promoted and the family moved to more prominent postings, Anne travelled separately with her mother, arriving after dark. During de Gaulle's years in the political wilderness of the 1930s, when he hosted military officials and politicians at home to discuss his controversial defense theories, Anne was kept in upstairs rooms with a dedicated nurse, her existence carefully hidden from visitors who might damage her father's career prospects. The hypocrisy becomes staggering when you consider de Gaulle's public persona. This was a man who spoke constantly about French civilization, about the nobility of suffering, about facing truth with courage. In 1940, he made his famous broadcast declaring that France has lost a battle but not the war, yet he had already lost a more personal battle with social prejudice. While he rallied the French to resist Nazi concepts of genetic superiority, his own daughter remained hidden because she didn't meet society's standards of genetic acceptability. During the war years in London, as de Gaulle built Free France from nothing, Anne stayed in the countryside with Yvonne. The official Free French records list de Gaulle's family as wife and 2 children, Anne's existence erased even from resistance documentation. When photographers captured the family, Anne was always absent, supposedly unwell or resting. The French public knew de Gaulle had 2 sons who would later serve with distinction in the military. They had no idea a 3rd child existed. Here's what makes this deception particularly heartbreaking. Witness accounts describe de Gaulle's behavior with Anne in private as extraordinarily tender. He would spend hours playing simple games with her, singing the children's songs she loved, holding her hand during her frequent seizures. One family friend, speaking decades later, recalled seeing the stern general on his knees playing with dolls because it made Anne laugh. This was the same man who couldn't acknowledge her existence to his own political allies. The family's solution was a country house in Colombey-les-Deux, Église, which became Anne's world. While de Gaulle commanded the liberation of France, dealt with Churchill and Roosevelt, and navigated the treacherous politics of post-war Europe, Anne lived in rural isolation with her mother and a small staff. The locals were told she was delicate, and needed country air. In reality, she was being hidden from a world her father was simultaneously trying to lead. The tragic irony deepens when you examine de Gaulle's writings from this period. He wrote extensively about the French spirit, about civilization's duty to protect the weak, about the moral superiority of French culture. Yet his own actions betrayed every principle he espoused. While publicly championing a France that represented humanity's highest ideals, he privately participated in the same shameful hiding that characterized the aristocrats he criticized. Anne's health was always fragile, complicated by her condition and the limited medical understanding of the era. In January 1948, she developed pneumonia. As she lay dying at age 20, de Gaulle faced a final choice between love and shame. He chose shame. Anne died at home with only immediate family present. The funeral was private, with only a small announcement that mentioned the death of the general's daughter, without details. Most French people learning of Anne's existence also learned of her death in the same breath. But here's where de Gaulle's story takes a different turn from our other examples. Grief seemed to break through his shame. Within months of Anne's death, he established the Fondation Anne de Gaulle for disabled children, finally acknowledging publicly what he had hidden for 20 years. He wrote, "Without Anne, I would never have done what I did. She gave me the heart and inspiration." Beautiful words, but they ring hollow when you consider she lived and died in shadow, because her father couldn't bear public judgment. The foundation became de Gaulle's monument to his guilt. He poured money and influence into it, ensuring it became one of France's premier institutions for children with disabilities. When he returned to power in 1958, he pushed through legislation improving rights for disabled citizens, rights his own daughter never enjoyed. The man who couldn't push Anne's wheelchair in public became a behind-the-scenes advocate for thousands of children like her. Modern parallels make this even more uncomfortable. Imagine if President Biden had never mentioned a disabled child, keeping them hidden while campaigning on compassion and decency. The scandal would define his legacy. Yet de Gaulle remains a French hero, his treatment of Anne relegated to footnotes in biographies that focus on his political achievements. Recently released family letters show the full extent of the deception. De Gaulle wrote detailed instructions about keeping Anne away from state functions, managing photographer angles to avoid her window, even planning separate travel routes to ensure she never encountered his political associates. This wasn't casual concealment. It was systematic erasure by a man who planned the liberation of France with less attention to detail. Yvonne de Gaulle's diary, published posthumously, reveals a woman torn between supporting her husband's career and protecting her daughter's dignity. She writes of Anne asking why she couldn't attend her father's speeches, why her brothers appeared in newspapers but she didn't, why visitors never came to see her. Yvonne's standard response, that Anne was special and needed protection, satisfied no one, least of all Anne herself, who despite her disability understood she was being hidden. The foundation de Gaulle created has helped thousands of children, but it stands as a monument to hypocrisy. Every child it serves represents what Anne could have been with acceptance instead of concealment. De Gaulle proved that even genuine love couldn't overcome social shame, that even heroes could be cowards when facing their own family's differences. The de Gaulles at least kept Anne at home, but across Europe, a more sinister system was operating, one that turned religious sanctuaries into dumping grounds for aristocratic shame. Religious institutions across Europe had a dark secondary purpose, hiding royal and noble embarrassments behind holy walls. What you're about to discover is a centuries-old network that turned convents and monasteries into luxury prisons for disabled aristocrats, all blessed by the church and funded by family guilt. The system was brilliantly cynical in its simplicity. A noble family would make a substantial donation to a religious order, along with their disabled child who would take holy vows they often couldn't understand. The church got funding and land, the family got rid of their shame, and the child disappeared behind walls that no one could breach without ecclesiastical permission. It was human trafficking disguised as religious devotion, and it operated openly for over 500 years. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked. In 1487, Isabella of Habsburg, born with what historians believe was severe autism, was called to religious life at age 7. The calling came with a dowry of 40,000 florins and 3 estates in Lower Austria. Her entry into the convent of St. Clara was celebrated as a holy occasion, but the truth was far darker. Isabella couldn't speak, showed no understanding of religious doctrine, and spent her days rocking in repetitive motions that the nuns interpreted as spiritual ecstasy. She lived there for 67 years, her family visiting exactly twice, once to deliver another payment, once to confirm she was still alive for inheritance purposes. The practice became so standardized that by the Renaissance, specific monasteries were known as repositories for noble mistakes. The Benedictine monastery at Melk in Austria, the Carthusian houses in France, certain convents in Spain. These became specialized institutions where disabled nobles were warehoused under the guise of religious life. The Church developed theological justifications, claiming these children were blessed by God with holy simplicity, and their families were performing acts of charity by dedicating them to religious life. Here's what makes this especially disturbing. These weren't standard religious vocations. Normal entrants to religious life underwent years of education and made informed choices. The disabled nobles were often placed before they could speak, taking vows they couldn't comprehend, bound for life to institutions they never chose. The Church created special categories, oblates, or perpetual children of God, that allowed them to accept these unwilling recruits while maintaining the fiction of voluntary religious commitment. The financial incentives were staggering. The monastery of San Lorenzo in Spain recorded receiving disabled children from at least 12 noble families between 1520 and 1750, each accompanied by donations that built new wings, funded artworks, and established perpetual trusts. One entry from 1623 records the arrival of Don Carlos, touched by God with sacred simplicity, whose family's generosity will ensure prayers for their lineage in perpetuity. Translation: a disabled kid whose parents paid to make him disappear. But the real horror was in the daily reality for these unwilling monks and nuns. Unlike genuine religious who found purpose in their calling, the disabled nobles lived in confusion and isolation. Records from the Abbey of Cluny describe Brother Philippe, actually Philippe de Bourbon, son of a duke, who spent 40 years asking when his parents would visit. Not understanding he'd been abandoned, the monks were instructed to tell him his family was traveling or at war, lies that continued for 4 decades until his death. The system had international reach. Italian nobles sent children to French monasteries. Spanish aristocrats used Portuguese convents, creating distance that made family visits impossible and discovery unlikely. The Church facilitated these transfers, with special papal dispensations that allowed disabled nobles to cross normal territorial boundaries. It was human trafficking with ecclesiastical approval, all justified as God's will. Some religious orders specialized in this dark trade. The Sisters of Perpetual Enclosure in Bavaria built their entire economy on housing disabled nobles, constructing special wings with higher walls and locked doors, features unnecessary for voluntary nuns, but essential for confused aristocrats who might try to leave. Their account books, discovered in secularization raids, show itemized billing for special care that included physical restraints and isolation cells marketed as contemplation chambers. Here's where modern parallels become truly chilling. Imagine if today's wealthy families could pay megachurches to take their disabled children, claiming it was for spiritual development, while ensuring they never had to see them again. The outrage would be immediate. Yet this system operated openly for centuries, blessed by popes and funded by the same families who patronized Renaissance art and claimed to embody Christian virtue. The testimony that survived is heartbreaking. A letter from Sister Maria Benedetta, smuggled out of an Italian convent in 1743, describes her confusion at being forced to take vows at age 8 when she couldn't read or understand Latin. She spent 30 years believing her placement was temporary, that her family would return when the war ended. There was no war. Her family had paid for perpetual care and never intended to see her again. The practice evolved but never truly ended. By the 19th century, as medical institutions emerged, the pipeline shifted from monasteries to religious-run asylums. The Sisters of Charity, the Brothers of Mercy, various Catholic orders established hospitals that were essentially the same system with medical vocabulary. Disabled nobles were now patients rather than oblates, but the core transaction remained. Families paid, children disappeared, and religious institutions profited from human disposal. One of the most damning pieces of evidence comes from the 1923 Vatican Archives release. which included correspondence about irregular vocations. Cardinal Benelli wrote to Pope Pius XI about concerns that certain Spanish convents contained those called by family rather than God. The Pope's response? Instructions to ensure donations were properly documented and that pastoral care continued for these special cases. Even the Vatican knew and sanctioned the practice. The Spanish Civil War exposed some of these arrangements, when Republican forces opened convents and found nobles who'd been hidden for decades. One account describes finding Doña Isabella de Silva, placed in a convent at age 5 for having epilepsy, now 60, and having spent her entire life believing she was an orphan, while her family lived in a palace 20 miles away. She had inherited titles and fortunes she never knew existed, all managed by the family that abandoned her. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was how recent this practice continued. Investigation of Franco-era Spain revealed noble families still using convents to hide disabled children through the 1960s. The convent of the Sacred Heart in Segovia housed Maria Teresa de Bourbon, a distant relative of the Spanish royal family, from 1943 until her death in 1978. Officially, she had a religious vocation. In reality, she had severe developmental disabilities, and her family paid the convent an annual sum that exceeded most Spaniards' lifetime earnings. The church's complicity extended beyond mere housing. They created elaborate theological justifications, claiming disabled nobles were suffering souls whose presence blessed the institution. They developed rituals and prayers specifically for these unwilling religious, creating a spiritual framework that disguised abandonment as sanctity. Disabled children weren't hidden. They were chosen by God for special grace. They weren't abandoned. They were given the gift of perpetual prayer. When secularization movements finally opened many of these institutions, investigators found generations of disabled nobles who'd lived entire lives in religious dress they never chose. Some had spent decades believing they had vocations, having been told since childhood that God had called them. Others lived in confusion, asking daily when their families would visit, when they could go home, why they had to wear habits and follow rules they didn't understand. These weren't isolated family decisions, this was systematic, and the medical establishment was complicit in ways that would make modern medical ethics boards recoil in horror. The most chilling part? Medical professionals, sworn to do no harm, actively participated in erasing these children. Doctors across Europe didn't just enable royal families to hide their disabled children, they created the medical framework that justified it, profited from it, and in many cases, hastened deaths through neglect, disguised as treatment. Dr. Francis Fox, chief physician at Royal Earlswood Hospital, became the architect of aristocratic erasure. Between 1870 and 1918, he personally signed commitment papers for at least 200 noble children, developing a classification system that transformed human beings into disposal categories. His scale of mental deficiency included special codes for aristocratic patients, ensuring they were segregated from common disabled people who might recognize them. Fox didn't just house these children, he created medical justifications for their families' abandonment, writing in one report that separation from family serves the dual purpose of protecting bloodline reputation and preventing emotional disturbance to the afflicted. The medical vocabulary these doctors developed was specifically designed to dehumanize while sounding scientific. Children weren't abandoned, they were therapeutically isolated. They weren't imprisoned, they were in protective residential care. They weren't neglected, they received minimal stimulation therapy. Every cruel practice had a medical term that made it sound like treatment rather than torture. When families asked about their hidden children, doctors could respond with medical jargon that obscured the reality of empty days and lonely deaths. But Fox was just the beginning. Across Europe, a network of physicians specialized in making aristocratic problems disappear. Dr. Heinrich Müller in Bavaria, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Charcot in France, Dr. Alessandro Morselli in Italy. These men built careers on providing medical cover for family shame. They attended conferences, published papers, and created an entire medical specialty around hiding disabled nobles. Their correspondence, discovered in various medical archives, reveals a chilling coordination. They shared techniques for falsifying death certificates, recommended specific drug cocktails to keep patients manageable, and developed standardized responses to deflect questions from curious relatives or journalists. The falsification of death certificates became an art form. Dr. Müller's personal notes, discovered after his death, included templates for various scenarios. A child with Down syndrome might officially die of congenital heart defect, technically possible but conveniently timed for when the family decided on institutionalization. Those with autism were recorded as dying from failure to thrive, even as they were admitted to institutions where they'd lived for decades. The medical establishment created a paper trail of deaths for children who were very much alive, abandoned in institutions these same doctors controlled. Here's what makes this particularly sickening. These doctors knew exactly what they were doing. Private letters between physicians discuss the ethics of their actions with shocking casualness. Dr. Privet Charcot wrote to a colleague in 1889, "The Marquis insists his son died last Tuesday. I have obliged with appropriate documentation." The boy himself seems unaware of his posthumous status and continues to eat heartily. They joked about their ghost patients, competed over who could make the most aristocratic children disappear, and charged fortunes for their discretion. The experimental treatments these hidden patients endured would violate every modern medical principle. Because they were officially dead and had no legal protection, doctors used aristocratic patients as test subjects for dangerous procedures. Hydrotherapy that was essentially waterboarding, electrical stimulation that caused seizures, surgical interventions to correct defects that left patients maimed, all justified as cutting-edge treatment for those beyond hope. Dr. Seeks T. Fox's treatment logs from Royal Earlswood detail subjecting the Bowes-Lyon sisters to ice baths, forced feeding, and isolation therapy that today would be recognized as torture. The pharmaceutical experimentation was equally horrifying. These doctors had unlimited access to patients who couldn't consent and families who didn't care. Early psychiatric drugs were tested on hidden nobles, with dosages that turned active children into sedated shadows. One report from 1934 describes testing a new sedative on Patient X, later identified as a Habsburg prince, at doses that kept him unconscious for days. The doctor noted this was beneficial for institutional management, without mentioning the patient lost the ability to walk due to muscle atrophy. Financial records reveal the staggering profits involved. Dr. Fox charged noble families 10 times the standard rate, with additional fees for discretion services. His estate at death was worth millions in today's money, built entirely on the suffering of children he helped erase. Similar wealth accumulated for doctors across Europe who specialized in this dark trade. They lived in mansions, collected art, and were respected members of society, while their patients lived in squalor, forgotten by everyone except the staff paid to manage them. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from medical conferences where these practices were discussed openly. The 1902 International Congress on Mental Hygiene included a session on managing aristocratic defectives, where doctors shared techniques for concealment. Papers presented included optimal sedation for long-term residential care and documentary solutions for sensitive cases. These weren't fringe practitioners, they were leaders in their field, creating academic frameworks for systematic cruelty. When reform movements finally began investigating institutional conditions, the medical establishment closed ranks. Doctors who had spent decades hiding aristocratic children suddenly discovered patient confidentiality when investigators arrived. Records disappeared, deaths were hastily certified, and transfers to even more remote institutions accelerated. Dr. Riti Müller burned his personal archives when authorities began investigating, but fragmentary records survived, showing he had falsified at least 47 death certificates for living noble children. The medical conspiracy extended to training new generations. Medical schools included discrete modules on handling sensitive family situations, teaching young doctors how to recognize when a family wanted a child to disappear and how to facilitate it. The Royal College of Physicians in London had an unwritten protocol for aristocratic admissions that bypassed normal procedures. Young doctors were taught that certain patients required special handling, code for hidden nobles who needed to remain invisible. Here's where modern context becomes essential. Today's medical ethics boards would instantly revoke licenses for what these doctors did routinely. Falsifying death certificates, experimenting on non-consenting patients, accepting bribes to hide children, any single offense would end a medical career. Yet these doctors were honored members of their profession, awarded medals, invited to royal courts even as they kept royal relatives locked in their institutions. The aftermath of exposure has been minimal. When journalists revealed these practices, medical institutions claimed historical context excused everything. The Royal College of Physicians issued a statement about different era standards, without acknowledging their members had violated medical ethics that existed even then. No posthumous censures were issued, no formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing recorded. The medical establishment that enabled centuries of erasure simply moved on, hoping collective amnesia would cover their complicity. Recent investigations have revealed this wasn't limited to Europe. Colonial administrators exported these practices, establishing institutions in India, Australia, and Africa, where aristocratic problems could be hidden even further from home. The British Raj included facilities specifically for noble children who couldn't be hidden in England. Distance made abandonment easier. Tropical diseases provided convenient explanations for deaths, and colonial medical systems asked fewer questions. But perhaps the darkest chapter was reserved for those who never made it past infancy, whose erasure was so complete that we're only now discovering evidence of their existence. For some royal infants, the decision was even more final. They simply never appeared in any record at all. What archaeological excavations and DNA testing are now revealing represents systematic infanticide dressed up as medical necessity, divine will, or simple non-existence. The medieval practice was horrifyingly straightforward. When a royal or noble baby was born with visible disabilities, decisions were made within hours. Midwives, sworn to secrecy and paid handsomely for silence, would declare the child born sleeping or too weak to survive. But testimony from witch trials and midwife prosecutions tells a different story. Marguerite Lesage, tried in France in 1623, confessed under interrogation that she had been paid by 3 noble families to ensure difficult births ended quietly. Her testimony described live infants declared dead, their cries muffled while families decided their fate. Archaeological evidence is now confirming what historians long suspected. Excavations near royal palaces across Europe have uncovered infant remains in unusual contexts, buried outside consecrated ground, hidden in palace foundations, disposed of in ways that suggest secrecy rather than standard burial practices. The Château de Fontainebleau excavations in 2018 found infant remains in what had been a sealed cellar, with bone analysis suggesting at least 12 newborns buried over 2 centuries. DNA testing confirmed royal lineage, but these children appear in no genealogical records. The Habsburg palaces have been particularly revealing. Ground-penetrating radar at Schönbrunn Palace detected anomalies that led to the discovery of what archaeologists delicately call irregular burials. These weren't standard infant deaths from high medieval mortality. The burial patterns suggest concealment, with remains found in locations that would have been hidden even when the palace was active. One heartbreaking discovery was an infant buried with a small golden rattle, suggesting someone cared enough to provide a grave good, but not enough to give the child a proper burial or record their existence. Spanish royal properties have yielded equally disturbing findings. The Alcázar of Segovia renovations uncovered a hidden chamber containing multiple infant remains, all showing signs of congenital conditions that would have been visible at birth. Radiocarbon dating placed them across 3 centuries, suggesting this wasn't isolated incidents but established practice. The bones tell stories the historical record tried to erase. Children with spina bifida, hydrocephalus, skeletal dysplasia, all conditions that would have marked them as unfit for royal lineage. But it's the documented near misses that truly reveal the scope. The private papers of Dr. Johann Steidele, Marie Antoinette's obstetrician, described delivering a royal infant in 1779 with a cleft palate. His notes detail the hours of debate. The baby was healthy otherwise, could have survived with care, but the visible deformity meant social shame. Steidele records being ordered to let nature take its course, medical code for withholding basic care until the infant died. He notes the child lived for 3 days without feeding before succumbing, officially recorded as born weak, survived briefly. The Russian imperial family's physician, Dr. Botkin, left even more explicit records. His private diary describes at least 4 Romanov infants born with disabilities between 1850 and 1890 who failed to thrive within days of birth. But Botkin's detailed medical notes tell a different story. These infants were isolated from their mothers, denied regular feeding, and given opium to ease their passing. One entry describes a baby with Down syndrome features who was healthy at birth, but died within a week after being moved to a cold room and fed only water. Botkin justified this as preventing greater suffering, but his own notes show the infant was vigorous at birth. Here's what makes this even more horrifying. These weren't desperate decisions by poor families lacking resources. These were the wealthiest, most powerful families in Europe, with access to the best medical care available. They could have afforded private nurses, special facilities, any accommodation needed. The choice to let these infants die was purely about bloodline purity and social standing. A baby who might have lived a full life with minimal support was condemned because their existence threatened dynastic prestige. The religious complicity adds another layer of horror. Priests and chaplains, who should have protected innocent life, instead provided theological cover. They developed doctrines about angels returning to heaven and souls too pure for earthly existence that justified infanticide as divine will. Baptismal records from royal chapels show suspicious patterns, gaps in numbering, crossed-out entries, births recorded then mysteriously absent from death registers. The church that preached about the sanctity of life participated in ending it when bloodlines were at stake. Some evidence comes from unexpected sources. The account books of the wardrobe, detailed records of royal household expenses, occasionally reveal discrepancies. Orders for nursery furniture that was never used, wet nurses hired then dismissed within days, physicians paid for complete discretion in delicate matters. These financial breadcrumbs lead to conclusions the official records tried to hide. One particularly damning entry from the English royal accounts in 1687 lists payment for disposal of household matter requiring special handling immediately after a birth that produced no recorded child. The Midwives' Guild records provide another window into these practices. Guild regulations from various European cities include provisions for handling difficult situations in noble houses, with standardized fees for different levels of discretion. The Prague Midwives' Guild Charter from 1580 actually includes a fee schedule, standard delivery, delivery with complications, and euphemistically, complete services including all necessary arrangements. That last category cost 20 times the standard rate, suggesting services far beyond normal childbirth assistance. Modern DNA analysis has confirmed what archaeology suggested. Remains found near royal sites show genetic markers consistent with conditions that would have been immediately visible at birth: Down syndrome, severe spina bifida, achondroplasia. These children didn't die naturally and weren't formally buried, yet their DNA confirms they were closely related to royal lines. Each tiny skeleton represents a decision to erase a life rather than acknowledge an imperfect heir. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from succession records that don't add up. Multiple royal genealogies show suspicious patterns, years-long gaps between children in an era when annual pregnancies were normal, references to pregnancies that produced no recorded births, occasional mentions of mothers mourning children who officially never existed. The Habsburg records are particularly telling, with at least 15 documented pregnancies between 1500 and 1700 that resulted in no official births despite full-term deliveries. Recent investigations have also uncovered purpose-built facilities. The discovery of a hidden room at Versailles during renovations revealed what historians believe was a holding chamber for unwanted royal infants. Too small for normal habitation but equipped with basic necessities, located near the royal birthing chambers but hidden behind false walls, it appears designed for short-term concealment. Similar spaces have been found in other palaces, suggesting a standard architectural feature for handling dynastic disappointments. These revelations are forcing uncomfortable reckonings. Museums displaying royal family trees are being pressured to acknowledge the missing children. DNA databases are revealing genetic conditions in royal bloodlines that should have produced more affected individuals than official records show. The mathematical impossibility of so few disabled royals when genetic analysis shows high carrier rates proves systematic erasure. The practice extended beyond immediate royal families. Noble houses across Europe adopted similar practices, creating a continent-wide conspiracy of infanticide among the elite. The Medici archives reference physicians who specialized in ensuring clean successions. The Prussian noble regulations actually codified when an heir could be set aside if born with certain conditions. What started as shameful family secrets became institutionalized practice with legal frameworks and medical protocols. These weren't isolated family tragedies or desperate decisions in moments of crisis. This was systematic elimination of children deemed genetically inferior by families who preached divine right while playing God with innocent lives. Each unmarked grave represents not just a death but a comprehensive erasure. A child who was conceived, grew, was born, breathed air, then vanished as if they never existed, because their existence threatened their family's image of perfection. These practices didn't end with the Middle Ages. They evolved and persisted into living memory, waiting for brave journalists to expose what royal families thought would stay buried forever. The 1980s brought a collision between ancient shame and modern journalism, and the truth was more horrifying than anyone imagined. What started as routine investigations into institutional care unveiled a systematic conspiracy that reached into the present day, with living victims still hidden in facilities across Europe. The first crack in the facade came in 1987, when journalist Valerie Pitt was researching conditions at Royal Earlswood Hospital. She noticed two elderly women who showed unusual interest whenever the royal family appeared on television, pointing at the screen and making excited noises. Most staff dismissed it as typical patient behavior, but one nurse, troubled by conscience after decades of silence, pulled Pitt aside. "Those are the Queen Mother's nieces," she whispered. "They're supposed to be dead." That single revelation launched an investigation that would shake the British establishment. Pitt cross-referenced hospital records with Burke's peerage, the official record of British nobility. What she found defied belief. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, recorded as dead in 1940 and 1960, one respectively, were very much alive in 1987, abandoned in an institution just miles from their families' estates. The story that followed in the British press created a scandal that would have destroyed any normal family, but the royals weren't normal, and their response proved it. The palace's initial reaction was denial, so brazen it insulted public intelligence. A spokesman claimed the royal family had no knowledge of the sisters' survival, despite documentation showing regular communication between the hospital and family lawyers about payment arrangements. When pressed, they shifted to claiming it was a family matter unrelated to the Queen, ignoring that these were her first cousins, sharing grandparents, blood relatives hidden while she projected an image of family values. But Pitt's investigation was just the beginning. Her revelations triggered what journalists called the domino effect. Suddenly, workers at institutions across Europe began speaking out. In Spain, a nurse at the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Montserrat revealed that 4 residents were actually members of noble families, hidden there since the 1940s. In Austria, staff at a psychiatric facility near Salzburg confirmed they housed what they called the aristocratic ward, an entire wing dedicated to nobles who officially didn't exist. The Spanish revelations were particularly shocking because they involved the post-Franco democratic government. In 2003, investigative reporter Carlos Montero discovered that the Spanish state had been paying for the care of disabled aristocrats who were officially dead, some for over 40 years. His investigation revealed a secret budget line in the Ministry of Health, specifically allocated for historical obligations, code for maintaining the hidden relatives of Spain's noble families. When Montero published his findings, 3 government officials resigned, rather than explain why democratic Spain was still hiding Franco-era secrets. DNA testing, just becoming widely available, added another dimension to these revelations. Families who had maintained their relatives were dead suddenly faced scientific proof of their lies. In one particularly dramatic case, a woman in a Belgian institution was proven through DNA to be the daughter of a prominent aristocrat who had held a funeral for her in 1962. The deceased daughter had spent 41 years believing she was an orphan while her father served in Parliament and appeared regularly in society pages. The German revelations came through an unexpected source: the fall of the Berlin Wall. East German intelligence, it turned out, had extensively documented West German noble families hiding relatives in institutions. The Stasi files, opened after reunification, contained surveillance reports on facilities where aristocrats placed their disappeared children. One file documented a count who visited his dead son monthly for 30 years, always under an assumed name, always ensuring no photographs were taken. The East Germans had planned to use this information for blackmail but never did. Even they found it too cruel to weaponize. Here's what makes these modern revelations particularly disturbing. They weren't historical discoveries about past practices. These were contemporary findings about ongoing concealment. The journalists weren't uncovering centuries-old secrets, but active conspiracies. In 1987, when the Bowes-Lyon story broke, there were at least 20 other hidden aristocrats in British institutions alone. Across Europe, investigators estimated hundreds of nobles living in care homes while their families maintained they were dead. The legal implications were staggering. Many of these hidden relatives had inheritance rights they never knew about, titles that had passed to other family members, and fortunes managed by the very people who had declared them dead. Italian courts faced particularly complex cases where deceased nobles were found alive after their supposed estates had been divided. In one case, a woman discovered in a Roman institution in 2005 was legally entitled to properties worth millions that her siblings had inherited after her death in 1959. The public response varied dramatically by country. In Britain, the scandal was treated as a royal embarrassment, but quickly buried under other news. The French, perhaps remembering de Gaulle's hidden daughter, showed more sympathy for families caught between love and shame. But in Scandinavia, where disability rights were more advanced, the revelations triggered serious soul-searching about how progressive societies had allowed such practices to continue. Some families, when exposed, doubled down on their cruelty. When journalists found the Marquis of B, son in a Scottish institution in 1991, having been hidden there since 1954, the family's response was to threaten legal action against the newspaper for invasion of privacy. They never visited their son, who died 2 years later, still believing his family would eventually come for him. The Marquis attended the funeral, the first time he'd seen his son in 37 years. Other families attempted damage control through sudden displays of care. After a Dutch nobleman's hidden daughter was discovered in 1994, he immediately transferred her to a luxury care facility and began visiting regularly, with photographers conveniently present. These performative reunions fooled no one. Decades of abandonment couldn't be erased with a few staged photos and belated birthday presents. The journalists who broke these stories faced extraordinary pressure. Valerie Pitt received death threats and legal notices. Carlos Montero had his phone tapped and his movements monitored. A German reporter investigating Bavarian noble families found his car vandalized, and his children followed to school. The message was clear. Exposing these secrets came with a price. Yet they persisted, driven by the horror of what they'd uncovered, and the knowledge that living people were still suffering in hidden institutions. What emerged from these investigations was a pattern so consistent it suggested coordination. The same methods appeared across different countries: false death certificates, isolated institutions, complicit medical staff, and families who believed their shame justified any cruelty. Whether in Britain, Spain, Germany, or Italy, the playbook was identical. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic practice, passed down through generations of aristocratic families who valued bloodline purity over basic humanity. The technology that enabled these exposures, DNA testing, computer databases, investigative journalism, also revealed how recently these practices continued. These weren't medieval barbarities, but modern cruelties. Children hidden in the 1960s and 70s were discovered in the age of the internet. Families who appeared on television promoting charities were simultaneously hiding their own disabled relatives. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its human cost. Modern science reveals the ultimate irony. These defective royals differed from their crowned cousins by just one microscopic detail, a difference that would mean nothing today, but meant everything to families obsessed with genetic perfection. Modern science reveals the ultimate irony. These defective royals differed from their crowned cousins by just one microscopic detail. A single extra chromosome, a minor genetic variation, a quirk of biology smaller than a speck of dust, determined whether a royal child would wear a crown or die forgotten in an institution. Take Down syndrome, the condition that condemned so many royal children to erasure. It's caused by one extra copy of chromosome 21, just one additional strand among the 46 that make us human. That's roughly 2% more genetic material, a difference so minute that it's invisible without sophisticated testing. Yet this microscopic variation was enough to transform a celebrated royal birth into a family secret, to turn a potential heir into a ghost, to make parents who commanded nations cower in shame. The science makes the cruelty even more senseless. Genetic analysis of royal bloodlines reveals they carried numerous hereditary conditions that were accepted because they were invisible. The Habsburg jaw, caused by centuries of inbreeding, was worn proudly in portraits. Haemophilia, the royal disease that threatened the lives of male heirs across Europe, was managed with care and concern. Porphyria, which may have caused George III's madness, didn't result in his erasure. But visible disabilities, conditions that couldn't be hidden under royal robes or explained away as eccentricity, triggered systematic abandonment. Here's what makes this particularly twisted. Royal families who obsessed over bloodline purity were genetic disasters waiting to happen. The Spanish Habsburgs inbred themselves into extinction, with Charles II so genetically compromised he could barely function. Yet they would have hidden a child with Down syndrome who might have been far more capable. Prince John of the United Kingdom, hidden away for having epilepsy, was by all accounts intelligent and loving, qualities that meant nothing against the stigma of visible disability. Modern genetic research has revealed just how common these conditions were in royal bloodlines. The rate of Down syndrome increases with maternal age, and royal women often had children later in life. Statistical analysis suggests there should have been far more royals born with visible disabilities than official records show. Where are they? Hidden in institutions, buried in unmarked graves, erased from history because an extra chromosome made them imperfect in their family's eyes. The bitter irony deepens when you consider what these erased royals might have contributed. Today, people with Down syndrome graduate from college, hold jobs, get married, and live fulfilling lives. People with autism, like Princess Alexandrin likely had, include brilliant scientists, artists, and innovators. The genetic variations that triggered royal abandonment are now understood as part of human diversity. Each hidden royal represents not just a personal tragedy but a loss to history, perspectives unheard, contributions unmade, lives unlived. Recent DNA analysis of remains found near royal properties confirms what historians suspected. Genetic diversity in royal lines was systematically suppressed. Testing of infant remains found at various palace sites shows a range of genetic conditions: Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, various forms of dwarfism. Each skeleton tells the same story: a child born different, erased rather than embraced. The very families who claimed divine right to rule couldn't accept that divinity might package itself differently. But science also reveals the lies used to justify abandonment. Royal physicians claimed these children were incompatible with life or unable to understand their surroundings. Yet institutional records show many lived for decades, some into their 80s. They claimed the children wouldn't recognize their families, but witnesses describe hidden royals getting excited when relatives appeared on television. Every medical justification for erasure has been disproven by modern science, revealing the abandonments as pure social prejudice dressed in medical language. The genetic testing has also exposed current lies. Several European noble families who maintained their bloodlines were pure have been forced to confront genetic evidence of hidden relatives. DNA databases have connected living people with aristocratic heritage they never knew about, descendants of nobles who were erased but had children before being institutionalized. These genetic ghosts are reclaiming their heritage, forcing families to acknowledge branches they tried to prune from their family trees. Here's a mind-bending perspective. Many of the royal families who hid disabled relatives probably carry the same genetic variations. Carriers of Down syndrome genetics don't express the condition but can pass it on. The same royal blood that sat on thrones carried the potential for the very conditions that triggered abandonment. Kings and queens, princes and princesses walk around with the same defective genes that condemned their relatives to institutions. The only difference was expression, a genetic lottery that meant crown or asylum. Modern successful people with the same conditions make the historical cruelty even starker. Actors with Down syndrome win awards and inspire millions. Athletes with autism compete in the Olympics. Artists with various genetic conditions create works that move the world. Each success story is a reminder of what those hidden royals might have achieved if given opportunity instead of abandonment. The Spanish infanta who was hidden in a convent might have been a patron of arts. The Prussian prince locked in an institution might have been a military strategist. We'll never know because they were never given the chance. The chromosome of fate extended beyond just genetic conditions. Epilepsy, now easily managed with medication, was grounds for royal erasure. Cerebral palsy, which doesn't affect intelligence, meant institutional abandonment. Deafness, blindness, any visible difference triggered the same response. Royal families who commanded armies and negotiated treaties couldn't handle a child who communicated differently or moved differently. The power to rule nations crumbled before the challenge of accepting difference. Recent revelations have forced uncomfortable questions about current royal genetics. When genetic testing became available, did royal families screen for the conditions that triggered historical abandonment? The British royal family's emphasis on Diana's good breeding takes on darker implications when you realise what they were screening against. Modern royal pregnancies are monitored with technology that could detect the very conditions that led to erasure. What happens now if a royal fetus shows that extra chromosome? The science of genetics has also revealed the futility of royal attempts at perfection. Every human carries genetic variations, mutations, and anomalies. The idea of genetic purity is scientifically nonsensical. We're all mutants in various ways. The royal obsession with perfect bloodlines was always doomed to failure, but it caused immeasurable suffering in the attempt. Children died, families were destroyed, and lives were erased in pursuit of an impossible standard that science shows never existed. So here we are, at the end of a journey through centuries of royal cruelty, and you're probably feeling a mix of horror, disbelief, and maybe even gratitude that you live in more enlightened times. But before you close this video feeling superior to these historical monsters, let me leave you with some thoughts that might keep you up tonight. Every single family we've discussed believed they were doing the right thing. They had medical professionals assuring them it was best for the child. They had religious leaders providing spiritual justification. They had social pressure, telling them that hiding disability was the compassionate choice. Sound familiar? How many modern practices will future generations judge as harshly as we judge these royal erasures? The Bowes-Lyon sisters died in the 21st century, Catherine in 2014. She lived through the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the internet, and the advent of social media, all while her family maintained she'd been dead since 1940. This isn't ancient history, it's yesterday. The last hidden royals might still be out there, elderly now, still waiting for families that will never come, still watching their relatives on screens while the world believes they don't exist. These weren't monsters. They were people like us who let shame override love, who chose reputation over relationship, who believed that difference meant deficiency. Each abandoned child started as a wanted pregnancy, a celebrated birth, a moment of royal joy that turned to horror when the baby didn't match expectations. The journey from nursery to institution, from heir to ghost, began with ordinary people making extraordinarily cruel choices. What haunts me most is the silence. Hundreds of people knew these secrets, doctors, nurses, servants, government officials, and said nothing. They went to work each day in institutions housing hidden royals, collected their paychecks, and went home to their own children. The conspiracy of silence required more than royal commands. It required ordinary people choosing compliance over conscience, every single day for decades. Modern DNA testing and investigative journalism have exposed these secrets, but they can't undo the damage. Every revealed case represents a life stolen, potential destroyed, love denied. The Spanish noblewoman who died believing she was an orphan while her family lived in luxury nearby. the Austrian prince who spent 50 years asking when his parents would visit, the British cousins who recognized their family on television but couldn't understand why they never came. Each story is a universe of pain that no exposure can heal. Here's what should really disturb you. These practices evolved rather than ended. We don't hide disabled relatives in institutions with false death certificates, but we have new ways of ensuring certain people never exist. The same impulse that made royals hide their disabled children, the terror of imperfection, the obsession with image, the prioritization of bloodline over humanity, finds new expressions in each generation. The methods change, but the mindset persists. So, what do we do with this knowledge? We remember that every society believes itself enlightened while practicing its own cruelties. We recognize that the distance between us and these royal families isn't as great as we'd like to believe. We understand that choosing love over shame, acceptance over abandonment, truth over lies requires active decision, not passive assumption. The royal families who hid their children weren't inherently evil. They were ordinarily human, which is perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. If it made you angry at the injustice, grateful for progress, and worried about what blindnesses we might harbor, even better. History's darkest chapters aren't warnings about exceptional evil, but mirrors reflecting ordinary human capacity for cruelty when powered by shame and enabled by silence. Share this video not because it's entertaining, though the story is darkly fascinating, but because remembering these erased lives matters. Every view, every share, every comment saying, "I had no idea," helps ensure these hidden royals aren't forgotten again. They lived, they mattered, and they deserve better than the families who were supposed to love them most. Comment below if you've ever heard family secrets that parallel these royal horrors. You'd be surprised how many ordinary families have their own hidden relatives, their own shameful erasures. Like and subscribe if you want more investigations into history's hidden truths, the stories powerful people hoped would die with their victims. Remember, every royal wedding you watch, every palace tour you take, every crown jewel you admire, was paid for by families capable of erasing their own children. That context matters. Those hidden royals are part of the story too, whether their families wanted them to be or not. Until next time, this is Torture Archive, reminding you that history's greatest horrors often hide behind its most beautiful facades. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop asking who's missing from the official story.